As a point of I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a sad day today, but it is also a just day. And I am somewhat saddened that when the shadow leader of the House, the Leader of the House, Jerry Brownlee, stood to take a call there, he didn't actually traverse what's led to the resignation of the Honourable John Banks. He instead tried to spray accusations around against other people. What's that? It's coming? Well, I'm happy to traverse the facts of this. The Labor Party will be supporting the motion because it would be ridiculous to have a by-election at this stage, but it is important that we have a clean democracy. And one of the ways that you have a clean democracy is that you have transparency of what goes wrong and people are held to account for their mistakes. And that's what's happened here. Mr. Banks failed to make declarations of his donations received during his mayoral campaign some years back, where he was standing for re-election as Mayor of Auckland and didn't succeed. But during that period, he received donations for a number of parties, including Sky City and .com, and he denied. He filed a declaration to say that he didn't know of those donations, and a court has found that he did. And that's why we are here today. But, Mr. Speaker, I think this episode brings into stark relief what happens when there are what I think are effectively abuses of the Electoral Act. The litany of mistakes by the ACT Party goes back a number of members and for a number of years that has led to this place. And they were only here in this place this time because of the deal that was done with the National Party, including in respect of the Tea Party, which I will come to. Mr. Speaker, you only have to go back 3 years and the ACT Party was already mired in controversy. The ACT Party was on its knees because its prior leader, Rodney Hyde, the so-called perk buster, was busted for perks. He had around him David Garrett. David Garrett had railed against short sentences and name suppression and was shown to be a hypocrite because he had obtained name suppression and discharge without conviction for his passport fraud, where he had stolen the identity of a dead baby and obtained a passport using it. He had been pushed onto the ACT Party by the Sensible Censoring Trust, whose members, including Garth McVicker, had supported him in those efforts to get a discharge without conviction and name suppression. And it was against that background that the ACT Party was in such a terrible state of affairs that they suffered a takeover from a septuagenarian, Don Brash, who wasn't even a member of their party. And he and Don Brash... it was actually a description, Mr. Finlayson. It was a description. So neither of them were members of the ACT Party at that time, but they saw political advantage to help the National Party. Remember, Don Brash was a former leader of the National Party and John Banks was a former minister of the National Party. They saw advantage for the National Party, and so they took over the ACT Party even while they were not members. They then stood in Epsom. I stood in the Epsom electorate. We had the embarrassing spectacle of Paul Goldsmith caught pulling out his own electoral hoardings. He was photographed doing it, and then the signal was sent to the electors of the Epsom electorate that they shouldn't vote for the National Party candidate, but they should rather vote for the ACT Party candidate in an attempt to use the single-seat lifeboat provision in the MMP legislation. Now, that legislation says that you have to normally get 5% of the seats in order to get representation in Parliament. If you get one seat, you get the proportion of your seats even if you get less than 5%. So someone can get 4% in an election and get no representation, but someone like the ACT Party could get one seat but say 2% and they would get proportionate representation, which is plainly unfair. Now, that's been recommended against by reviews of the MMP environment. It's widely hated by electors and it in fact brings democracy into disrepute. And, you know, that's a bad thing because democracy is such an important thing. But nonetheless, the National Party persists in supporting that rule. We've got a private members bill to close that loophole that's been drawn. The National Party has said that they will not vote for it or advance it. And the reason is that they do these deals such as which they did with John Banks. Strange, though, that they backed him because, you know, you'd think that this was the party of fiscal rectitude. This was John Banks, who on the record had tripled council debt when he was last mayor. So he was hardly a fiscal conservative. This was all about political advantage. So we then come to the tea tapes. The tea tapes, I was actually there on the day. The media tipped me off. I was standing in the electorate. I went along to the cafe. The whole thing was a stunt. Everyone knows that. There are about 40 journalists there with cameras clicking away. They have an interview with John Key and John Banks, and John Key tells people they should vote ACT and not for Paul Goldsmith and the local electorate. And then they have a staged cup of tea behind some glass with 40 cameras there. It was a publicity stunt. It was public. Ambrose, the photographer, left a container on the table, which was a recording device that uploaded automatically to his camera. He didn't know it was operating, according to what he said. Got back to the office and he found that he had audio of the conversation between Banks and Key. Key then calls in the police against the media to use against the media during an election. Uses the power of state against the media during an election, caused a week of controversy, which suited him because he was the centre of attention for a week, and then at the end of it, the police didn't prosecute, but John Key deemed him to be guilty. That's what John Key said. He deemed him to be guilty, despite the fact he always had two defences. One, that it was inadvertent, if you believe what he says, and I've got no reason to doubt him, and two, that it was a public event. There was no way a court was ever going to convict that journalist for what happened there, because it was a publicity stunt gone wrong. So here we have it. Now, after that, comes in here, and it's found out that he lied about his donations. And I can say that. He lied about his donations. And it's true, and I can say that, and that will forever be to his shame. He pretended that he couldn't remember a helicopter trip to .com's mansion. He pretended that he hadn't asked for the cheques to be split into two amounts so it was less obvious. He pretended that he didn't know the donations, and none of those lies, because they were lies, were believed by the court. John Key knew this at the time because it was set out in the witness statements that were produced by the police, but he refused to read them because he didn't want to know, because it didn't suit his political imperative, which was to keep John Banks's vote in this House despite... yeah, that's right. He refused to look at the facts that showed him to be a liar. Now, we've seen other instances with that, with Peter Dunn and the GCSB fiasco. We've seen other acts... Thank you. We've seen other acts of unprincipled behaviour, Mr Speaker, by John Key and the National Party. Mr Speaker, this is yet another reminder as to why MMP needs to be changed to remove the single-seat lifeboat. The Right Honourable Winston Peters agrees with this. The Green Party agree with this. The Right Honourable Winston Peters, even though it's not in his interests to have a 5% threshold, says we should keep the threshold at 5% and not have the single-seat lifeboat for the likes of John Banks, because he is a man of principle. So are the Green Party and so are we. We could all seek electoral advantage from this, but none of the other parties do. Right Honourable Winston Peters recognises that the threshold is appropriate to keep out the loony parties, essentially, that have got very little support but could distort Parliament, which is exactly what John Banks has done for the last 3 years, and it's a shameful stain upon our Parliament that the police did not prosecute. The police did not prosecute. They were happy to deem Ambrose guilty, but they wouldn't prosecute John Banks. They did not prosecute John Banks. The police were politicised by... What's that? Well, it's absolutely disgraceful that the Prime Minister used the media used the police against the media during election, then deemed Ambrose guilty when he would never have been convicted. Mr Speaker, this is a stain upon this House. We ought to be criticising John Banks. We ought to be criticising the things that led to this not being brought to a head many years earlier, Mr Speaker, because effectively the government's got away with it. The government's got away with it. For 3 years, they were able to close their eyes to what was an obvious rorting of the system. Mr. Speaker, it is just that John Banks was convicted, albeit sad.
Speaker.
I call the honourable member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.